Are you ready for this?
Ain't nothing else in the world I'm more ready for.
And now we make out. And hopefully that was as funny as it was
I,
the first time we did this 2 weeks ago.
I forgot you said that. Yeah. So this is a re-record of this episode. We recorded this 2 weeks ago and then had a technical issue that I discovered when editing, and we're both very sad about it for a period of 10 days or so. I know personally for myself and Russell, I think this is something we have in common. That sort of setback is damaging, um, and can be difficult for me to recover from. Is that, am I accurate in ascribing that to you as well?
Yeah, for sure. There are definitely moments over the last couple of weeks where I was like, ah, I don't know if I want to do this again. I don't think, because this is the thing, right? I would say over the short lifespan of this podcast that last episode was easily the best, and it sucks that we
Yeah.
lost that to technical difficulties. But we're going to try to replicate that as best we can. But if we do somehow mention like, oh, we already talked about that, please understand that it is a little gaffe on our part because we did literally talk about this book and film 2 weeks ago to quite a significant extent. I think we talked for about over an hour and a half about this week's episode's material. So, yeah, just a little disclaimer there at the beginning.
Yes. Yep. And also, as you say, this week's episode, just to note that like I'm going to upload this as soon as it's ready, and then also release the next episode on schedule on Thursday. So a little twofer for our maybe like 5 fans this week who we left in the lurch a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah. In the spirit of Thanksgiving, which at the time of recording was 3 days ago, we're very thankful for the five of you. Very thankful that I get to participate in this podcast with you, Zach. Very thankful for good literature and good, and sometimes not good adaptations of said literature. Um, if you don't celebrate Thanksgiving, like most of the people where I'm currently residing, well, thanks anyway. Zach, what are you thankful for? You can't say anything that I just mentioned.
I can't say anything that you just mentioned. Well, you didn't
Yeah.
say doing this podcast with yourself, so I'm going to say I'm thankful for doing this podcast with you. I'm
Ah,
thankful
there's one.
for. I had a lovely little Thanksgiving here with just a few friends I had over. I made a leg of lamb, and everybody bought way too much food to go with it. We had multiple kinds of potatoes. We had like 4 pies, far too much wine to drink, and that was a nice experience. So that's what I'll say I'm thankful for currently.
Nice. I'll add a goofy one. Thankful for fruit. Fruit rules. I went to the store today. I bought a watermelon, some apples, some nectarines, some grapes, over 2 pounds worth of grapes. I gotta say, one of the things about living in South Africa as opposed to the US, fruit pretty affordable, and I'm pretty
Mm.
pretty thankful for that. I feel like, yeah, I wouldn't imbibe in the cornucopia that I have, as I've just sort of outlined previously, if I were in the United States, because I'm not paying $6 for an apple at New Seasons, local grocery store in Portland, Oregon. But yeah, anyway, thankful for fruit.
That's good. Fruit's good. And this isn't something I'm thankful for. We're leaving that topic already because I'm just salty at heart, I guess. But I went to the grocery store the other day, and the cashier asked me, "Hey, can I get a sneak peek of your ID?" And I said, "Man, you can even get the full release." And he did not get that joke. He just didn't respond at all. There was no reaction. But I figured that you would probably appreciate that, at
I,
least in the context of this podcast.
I would have. I would have. That's very good thinking, like on your feet there. I'm sorry that your witticism wasn't appreciated by the cashier at unnamed grocery store.
It was actually at New Seasons.
Oh, nice. New Seasons, you suck. But if you want to give us money, we'll take it, and we'll say that you're the best grocery store in the world.
Yeah, those are the rules, right? It's all companies are bad until they sponsor your art
Yeah,
project, which I guess this is an art project.
for real. All right. Well, with that, welcome once again to Source Material, a podcast about adaptation. My name is Russ Lupsher,
I'm Zach K.
and we are discussing If Beale Street Could Talk by James Baldwin and adapted by Barry Jenkins. So, yeah, I suppose, we should begin by talking about James Baldwin, iconic American writer. Zach, have you read any of his work previously before reading If Beale Street Could Talk?
No, James Baldwin is an author who I was aware of. I'd heard his name, but had never really ventured in there. And then since I guess planning to read If Beale Street Could Talk for this podcast, I've mentioned that to a handful of people, all of whom have been like, "Oh yeah, James Baldwin. I've read XYZ. You should read these other stuff by him," and I made me feel very uncultured. So, what about you, Russell?
Yeah, I read The Fire Next Time a couple of years ago, and I've read Giovanni's Room. But this is the third sort of longer work that I've read by him. There was a film created in 2016 called I Am Not Your Negro, which takes some of his writing and is narrated over sort of a documentary style feature of three civil rights leaders, them being Medgar Evers, Martin Luther King Jr., and Malcolm X, so folks that James Baldwin had an intimate relationship with. I highly recommend that film, and that sort of feels like you're uh, engaging with James Baldwin's sort of language because you are taking in the letters that he had written, the words. It's just sort of overlaid over imagery. So I highly recommend that if folks haven't checked it out. But yeah, James Baldwin, fantastic writer. I guess we'll just start off with that. I don't think that that's a hot take. I think, widely considered one of the greatest American writers of the 20th century, certainly within sort of like the black and queer spheres as well. He was born August 2nd, 1924, in New York City, and he passed away December 1st, 1987, in St. Paul de Vence, France. Zach, I have no idea if I said that name correctly. I hope so, but I'm really open to you criticizing my French at any point over the course of this project, but I tried.
Well,
We're moving immediately.
it's
Shut up. We're moving. Okay, so James Baldwin, he was the oldest of nine kids and grew up in relative poverty. And when he was growing up, he really wanted to be a pastor. So he, spent his teen years in this church studying to become a pastor or a preacher. And you kind of see that because the Bible had a significant influence on his life, but also like within the context of his writing. Many people will say that the pacing and sort of the language that he uses within his work is very much influenced by the Bible itself. However, he grew quite disgruntled by sort of the church's views, not only on LGBTQI plus issues, but then also on their stance towards like black liberation within the United States, and just totally moved on from that and decided to move to Paris, France at the age of 24, where he spent most of his life, periodically coming back to the United States, certainly later in his life, but for the most part was too dismayed by the state of the United States at the time and would rather live in a country that was, at the time, far more accepting of folks like him.
that's a very much a theme in this work, right? Is the state of the United States is kind of the whole thing, but leaving the United States is something that comes up for a number of characters in this story. Certainly for Fani talks about it with his friend whose name I'm blanking on at this moment. You know who I'm talking about. And then there's also the old Italian grocery woman who's like, "Yeah, I've been in this country a really long time, and I hope not to die here," which was a poignant moment from a side character, I felt.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, we'll get into that in just a moment. If Beale Street Could Talk was published in 1974. It's Baldwin's fifth novel, but 13th book overall. The title is in reference to Beale Street Blues by W.C. Handy from 1916. I wasn't able to find a recording of that specific song by W.C. Handy, but I did find a cover by Louis Armstrong. Overall, the book was received quite well. Joyce Carol Oates, very popular literary figure of the mid 20th century, reviewing for the New York Times, said, "If Beale Street Could Talk is a moving, painful story. It is so vividly human and so obviously based upon reality that it strikes us as timeless," which is something that I'm sure we're going to talk about in just a second, because this does feel like a very much a novel that has that timeless quality to it. I would argue that the issues that Baldwin discusses within the context of the story have never been more relevant. And so, yeah, it very, very prescient point there by Joyce Carol Oates. I think that this may be a good opportunity to start talking about the story and what it's all about. So, Zach, do you have any thoughts before we jump into the novel itself?
No, let's talk about the story.
Okay, so essentially, the story is just quite a simple love story between two characters, being named Clementine and Alonzo, but going by Tish and Fonny. They grow up in New York City, and it is essentially their love story together, but in sort of the setting of their youth and the challenges that they face, like outside of their relationship, both from their like immediate families, immediate communities, but then also these larger sort of societal structures that exist to, in a way, oppress them. So the most important thing that's sort of preventing them from living a happy life together is that Fonny is imprisoned, and he is imprisoned for a crime that he did not commit, which was rape. And so the course of the story is essentially Tish trying to get Fonny out of jail and, have them, reunite together and spend the rest of their lives together. Should be noted also that Tish is pregnant with Fonny's child.
Yeah, and so I'll interject and add that Fonny has not been sentenced yet at the time of the story. He's just been accused of this crime, and the story is really broken up into two timelines that are interwoven with each other. There's the current timeline of this journey of Tish being pregnant. Fonny's in jail. They're trying to get him out. They're trying to figure out like when is there going to be a trial. There's the struggle with the American justice system, and then there's also what are kind of flashbacks into Tish and Fonny's history together, both as children when they first met and then became best friends, and then as young adults as their relationship, I'm going to say matured, even though I don't necessarily think that's the right word, but matured and transformed perhaps into a romantic one as opposed to just a close childhood friendship.
Yeah, and there's a plethora of side characters that sort of interweave within sort of the narrative of this relationship. I think that the most important characters, at least the outset of the story, are the immediate families of the couple. So we have Tish and her family, who are supportive. She has a sister, I think is an older sister, Ernestine,
Mm-hmm.
and then her mother and father, and then Fonny has two sisters and a mother and father. The father very much loves Fonny, adores him, but there's a strained relationship, which is maybe putting it very lightly, between the mother and the sisters and Fonny. One of the more powerful scenes in the film is when Tish is revealing, shortly after she revealed to Fonny, which is at the very beginning of the story, that she was pregnant. She takes it upon herself to reveal to her family that she is pregnant with Fonny. They react as all parents, I'm sure, would, with, "Oh wow, like that's a shock," but come around quite shortly after that immediate shock and are very, very much pleased, very happy that at least Tish seems happy with the situation and plans to marry Fonny once this whole business of him being released from incarceration is dealt with. They call over Fonny's family, who are the Hunts, and things do not go as well as it did with Tish's family. Zach, would you like to?
Yeah, I want to slow this down and talk a little bit more about Fonny's family. So his dad, Frank, is very much like an everyman, just good kind of menschy dude, and that's contrasted by Fonny's mom, who I am still not sure ever actually gets a first name, but she is a very churchy person. You mentioned how Baldwin was, quote, disgruntled, unquote, with the church. And one of the early scenes in the novel is Tish and Fonny as children accompanying his mom to church. And it really dives into the showiness and, I'm going to say, performative nature of her relationship with the church, right? Like, she goes up to the front of the congregation and turns around and faces everybody and kneels before sitting down. And it talks about how she's kind of clearly trying to engage in a battle of one-upsmanship with another of the congregation members. And also that Fonny's mom very clearly gets a sense of superiority from doing this. This is sort of her personality. This is where she finds her own place in the world, but not in a like, this is my community, this is my place, but as in like, this is an identity that I can ascribe to myself and then feel good and superior for it. So, as you mentioned, Tish and Fonny are not married. As they announce this child, Fonny's mom does not care for it. She says mean things that are churchy in the word usage, but certainly not the sort of thing that Jesus would ever say about an unborn child. She curses it. She says, "Who's going to take care of this baby?" Tish says, "The mother and the father." And then Fonny's mom says stuff like, and you can help me out here because I'm not going to get this exactly right, but it's like,
I got
you've
you.
been a scourge on my son, and you and this baby are going to hell, and hopefully my son will survive and get the Lord's forgiveness, which is, pretty rough thing to say about your grandson, but really any child.
Totally. Yeah, the exact line is the Holy Ghost will cause that child to shrivel in your womb, but my son will be forgiven and my prayers will save him. So, invoking the power of, God or religion, essentially, to essentially damn what would be her future daughter in law and the child within, and her grandchild, as you pointed out. She is unhappy with the circumstances. And Frank's response, reminding you that this is Fonny's father, is incredibly upset by this statement and actually hits Fonny's mother across the side of the face. She collapses on the floor, and immediately Tish's father, Joseph, takes Frank and they leave to kind of go and like cool things down and sort of discuss this matter. Because Frank, he's, as we mentioned, he is, they got that everyman sort of attitude, and it's just like, oh, okay, cool, this is fine, this is fine, like we'll deal with this like we've dealt with every other thing, and is quite pleased at the idea, I think, of having a grandchild. He takes that hex that Mrs. Hunt has placed on his future grandchild to heart, and has a bit of an outburst that becomes physical. It then only escalates even further with some choice language. The word rhyming with Fonny's last name coming up a couple of times. Let you kind of parse out what that is, and eventually, some choice insults thrown back and forth, such as "Blessed be the next fruit of thy womb. I hope it turns out to be uterine cancer, and I mean that." That is Ernestine yelling towards the sisters and the mother as they are sort of ushered out of the Tish's family's apartment.
Ernestine really shows up here for Tish in a almost like comically aggressive way, but it feels very genuine in the story. I like Ernestine a lot. She's like, "Listen, my family are nice people, but I am not. I am mean, and I will hurt you if you ever come over here ever again." And she says it meaner than I just did, but that's what happens, and I found it kind of delightful and heartwarming in its own cruel way.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you mentioned, sort of the setup of the families, the piety of Fonny's mother, whether how sincere that is up to question. And then this scene sort of take up the bulk of the beginning of the novel, sort of around page 80 in my edition, out of 170 odd pages. We actually get the first mention of the case and sort of what is happening with Fonny, the accusation leveled against Fonny.
Real quick, Russ, I'm sorry. Before we move into this, I had one more thought I wanted to say about that last scene, which is in that discussion between Sharon, who's Tish's mom, and Fonny's mom, in that heated argument, Sharon says quite pointedly, as to the themes of the novel, when we were here as slaves, none of us were able to get married. They didn't, the white man didn't put us at a chapel and marry us, but we all still had kids and we all still loved them, and that's what was done. And it's not because Tish and Fonny don't want to get married that they're not, or that they're in this circumstance. It's a systemic issue of oppression keeping these two people outside of those systems of wedlock, essentially, which kind of frames a lot of what happens, right? And I think that was just a very poignant moment from Sharon.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the point of the story, right, is a criticism of these larger oppressive structures which still exist, and we're going to get to a couple more of those in just a second. But one of them that ties in nicely to what I was about to say is sort of the failing of the justice system, particularly when it comes to people of color, right? And so as we get into the details of the case and so the accusation levied against Fonny, the lawyer that is representing Fonny or fighting on his behalf is a guy named Mr. Hayward. He previously had a relationship with Ernestine, not a romantic relationship. She just knows him, and he's sort of a young lawyer that has taken an interest in the case, and the family is skeptical, as they very well should be, given the fact that a lot of the times, especially in this time period, like these cases didn't exactly end up working out in the defendant's favor, right? So Hayward has, some unfortunate news for them in that it is unlikely that without, specific testimony of the rape victim, that Fonny will be released from prison. So what has essentially happened is Fonny has been accused of raping a Puerto Rican woman who goes by two names, Mrs. Rogers and Mrs. Sanchez, and she is nowhere to be found. And it, without her testimony, sort of suggesting that Fonny did not.
Let me take this time to talk about this case, because in my reading of the text, and please tell me if you disagree, there is no possible way that Fonny is guilty of this crime, right? It is not up for interpretation. This is not a gray point in the story. This is just delineated, did not happen. And they talk about, in the novel more than in the film, specifically how we got into this situation, right? So there's a scene later in the novel, and I know we're getting out of chronological order, but that's okay because nothing in the story is chronological anyway, where essentially Tish and Fonny have a dust up with some young white dude in a grocery store who's hitting on Tish inappropriately. And Fonny shows up and kind of like pushes him out of the store and maybe kicks him while he's down a little bit physically. And then this cop walks up and gets in Fonny's face and says, like, what are you doing? Like, we were assaulting this essentially white boy. He doesn't say it that way, but that's the very thinly veiled subtext of the scene. And Tish physically inserts herself in between the two of them. And eventually the old Italian woman, who I briefly mentioned at the top of the pod, comes out and vouches for Fonny. But that cop never, ever, ever lets go of that grudge, essentially stalks the two of them, and is the one who eventually arrests Fonny for this crime, says that he saw him leaving the scene, but then had to go arrest him at his home, which is across town. And it's very clearly like this one cop's vendetta against Fonny specifically. They put him in a lineup, and in the novel they say this, but they don't in the film, which is fine. They put him in a lineup, and he is the only black man in this lineup. So when the victim is saying it's a black man, and then they only present one option for a black man in the lineup, of course she picks Fonny, even though it was clearly not him. It could not have been. And so that's how we've gotten into this situation. I'll let you continue your breakdown of the news that the young lawyer has for our unfortunate heroes.
Yeah, and so thank you, Zach. Yeah, so Officer Bell, just for clarification, is the police officer that has it out for Fonny. Yeah, Haywood makes it clear to Tish and her family that they will essentially need Mrs. Rogers slash Sanchez to like rescind on her accusation against Fonny, right? And so that is going to cost a lot of money. The family doesn't have the ability to just up and buy a ticket to Puerto Rico, and then how would they find her when they get there? And so we see that this is sort of the plan that is made to hopefully get Fonny out of jail and have the accusation sort of dropped. In between that, you mentioned that it doesn't sort of follow a linear plot, right? It sort of jumps back and forth between these different moments of the course of Fonny and Tish's life. We get that scene within the Italian grocer, but there are other just normal domestic scenes with the two of them trying to rent a loft and the the challenges that they face in doing that, right? So Tish, for example, could go and find a place that they would like to live, and she can get all these promises that the space is for her, of course, and then Fonny shows up, clearly in a relationship with Tish, a romantic relationship, and then all of a sudden, like, oh no, the space has been already promised to somebody else. I'm sorry, right? The assumption there being that the renter had his eyes on Tish and now seeing that she's in a relationship, doesn't have any interest in renting to the couple, and therefore has no interest in renting to black folk in the community. There is another character that pops up briefly, and I feel free to interject here, Zach, if you would like to provide more context. But his name is Daniel. He wasn't exactly a very close friend of Fonny from back in their youth, but when they do run into each other, there's warmth that is shared between Fonny and Daniel. And Daniel is invited over for a couple of beers, says, hey, Tish will cook us something up, like, let's spend some time together. And it really sort of highlights the intimacy that can exist within this community. Some other relationships that have that shared intimacy would be, Fonny with a server at a Spanish restaurant, right? They just have a good bond, and I think we can call back to Tish and like the shared bond between her family members, and then also Frank and Joe, right? Like these different characters that are sharing this wonderful warmth between one another. And I think that really ties in nicely to one of the things that James Baldwin has mentioned about this book itself, is that it is a book about optimism and pessimism, right? About like joy and despair. And I think we see those things manifest quite nicely in the story. Zach, do you want to talk a little bit about Daniel's inclusion in the story? He briefly is mentioned sort of within the middle part of the story, but I think it sets up some foreshadowing for Fonny's case.
Yeah, absolutely. First, I'm going to comment on your point about this story being about the not just dichotomy of experience, but the simultaneous experience of joy and despair and love and hope and hopelessness that is everywhere in this story, right? And you see that inside of communities. Tish's family, Fonny and Daniel, Fonny and Pedrocito, but also the strife that can still exist inside these communities with Fonny's family specifically. Later on in the novel, they talk about how Fonny's mom and sisters have agreed to actually testify against him in the trial, which is a pretty horrific thing. But Daniel specifically is a cautionary moment of what essentially will happen to Fonny. And you said foreshadowing, which is the right word. Daniel has been, as he reveals to Fonny and Tish over their dinner, in prison for a crime he did not commit. This time it was car theft. He says, they got me for stealing a car. I don't even know how to drive a car. but when they came to arrest him, he had some weed, some marijuana on him, and it was easier for him to take a plea for the car theft than take the drug charge, which is absurd. There's a lot to be said about drug policy in the United States, which is changing a little bit these days, but that's not really the point of the story, so I'll leave it there. I will interrupt now to mention some stats from a study from, I want to say, University of Baltimore. For some reason this isn't in this specific note of mine, but I will link it in the show notes. And this is a study about the American prison and judicial system and race. And so I'm just going to read some facts here that are relevant to the case. This is a very recent study. I believe it was finished in 2022. Black people are 13.6% of the American population, but 53% of the 3,200 exonerations listed in the National Registry of Exonerations. Judging from exonerations, innocent Black Americans are 7 times more likely than white Americans to be falsely convicted of serious crimes. In addition, Black people who are convicted of murder are about 80% more likely to be innocent than other convicted murderers. Innocent Black people are almost 8 times more likely than white people to be falsely convicted of rape. A prisoner serving time for sexual assault is more than 3 times more likely to be innocent if he is Black than if he is white. The major cause of this huge racial disparity is the high danger of misidentification of Black suspects by white victims of violent crimes. And these are the numbers behind what is happening in this story. So I will leave them there and encourage people to click through to the study and read more about them.
Yeah, I mean, again, we mentioned at the beginning, like these societal failings that have primarily worked against people of color and other immigrant groups that have come to the United States are really taken to task in this novel, right? You mentioned, Zach, the scene with the Italian grocer, right? Like there is a history of anti-Italian sentiment in the United States, right? One of the person who finally rents a loft to Fonny and Tish is a young Jewish man, right? And he, has the decency to basically just come out and say when Fonny asks him, like, "Hey, like, sorry, this is maybe an awkward question, but why are you doing this? Like nobody has given us the time of day." And he's like, "Well, I just, I just want to see like love flourish," right? Which is again like a moment of optimism, and it may seem cheesy, but like, in the context of like the story, and maybe in life, maybe it's a very simplified thing to say, but like, love and kindness is like the very least that you can do, right, to make the lives of others a little bit better. Yeah, I think that's touching upon those incarceration statistics, right? The police brutality that is embodied by Officer Bell, and then of course, as we've just mentioned, the systemic failings that have had a negative effect on Black and Brown folks, certainly LGBTQI plus folks, and then various immigrant groups. Baldwin touches upon all of that within this novel, right? And I think that is truly one of like the successes of this story, which is in essence really just a love story, but with so much more to it. Um, the novel, as we sort of reach the conclusion, and Zach, feel free to jump in if you have anything else you'd like to say. Sharon, Tisha's mother, eventually does make a trip out to Puerto Rico, where she embarks on a journey to try to find Mrs. Sanchez, and just plead with her to change her stance on the matter, right, on the rape accusation. We go through this whole series of her going to a nightclub and getting driven around by a local named Jaime, who is very helpful and very kind, and eventually she finds Mrs. Sanchez in a favela, and they have a face-to-face meeting where she says, like, how could not how could you do this, but like, surely you can't believe this. Like, I know this boy. He has not done something like this. And Mrs. Sanchez says, like, how do you know? How do you know that he couldn't have done this thing? And she pulls out a photo of Fonny and Tish and said, I swear to you that this is not something that this boy ever did. Mrs. Sanchez, having been accosted by Sharon, Tish's mother, for quite some time within the story, eventually breaks down and has this hysteric episode, and Sharon is forced to leave Puerto Rico and return, and is unsuccessful in her attempts to get Mrs. Sanchez to change her. I keep saying accusation. I want to use a different word, but that is
Identification, maybe, like, yeah,
yeah,
it's,
of Fani. Her full name Victoria Sanchez. Am I correct there, Zach?
that sounds right to me. Yeah.
Okay, Zach, you want to talk about the ending?
No, I mean, it's different, right? The ending is one of the biggest differences between the novel and the film, and I know we're not quite into talking about the adaptation yet, but in the film, certainly, and maybe less so in the novel, Sharon's trip is sort of the climax, as far as you might discuss like plot structure of the story, and that scene between her and Mrs. Sanchez is very highly emotionally strong. It was difficult to watch. It was slightly less difficult to read. Oh, you know what we haven't mentioned yet, Russell, is that, and by mentioned yet, I mean this iteration of recording this episode, is that we did a thing that we hadn't done previously, which is that we neither of us had interaction with this story at all before preparing for this podcast, and so I watched it first and then read it, and then Russell, you did the opposite. So I'm sure we will jump into discussing how that colored our interpretation of the ending because it is different. So in in the novel, Sharon comes back from Puerto Rico. They're like, okay, well, I guess maybe this is kind of hopeless. The trial date gets moved back because of inefficiencies in the justice system. It is really briefly mentioned that Frank essentially kills himself in his car, kind of glossed over in the novel, but doesn't happen in the film, and then that's it in the book. That's it. That's the end of the story, and it just kind of ends, and there's no resolution. There's no real path forward or hope. The film takes a slightly different tack and adds on what is essentially an epilogue. It talks about how, okay, well, Sharon came back with nothing, so Fani ended up taking a plea, took a deal, and then cuts to several years later where Tish is visiting Fani with their now born and I don't know, several year old child, like maybe 7 or 8. I don't really understand how children age, so that's my best guess. And that changes for me the feeling of the end. Maybe we'll get more into that as we discuss the adaptation, but that's pretty much what happens.
Yeah. Let's jump to the film, and then we can kind of conclude our discussion and sort of bring them together before concluding the today's episode. So, If Beale Street Could Talk was adapted to film by Barry Jenkins, who many people may know as the director of Moonlight, which won the Academy Award for Best Picture in 2016. In rather dramatic circumstances. It was the Oscars where there was the mix up between who had won, right? Was it La La Land or Moonlight? The people from La La Land went up to accept the award, and then Moonlight ends up being the Best Picture winner. So, those, if you need a reminder, that's that. It's a pretty large cast of characters. Kiki Lane plays Tish. Stefan James plays Fani, and then we have some other features from Colm Domingo, Teyonah Parris, Michael Beach, Dave Franco, Diego Luna, Pedro Pascal, Ed Skrein, Brian Tyree Henry, and then Regina King. Regina King ended up winning a Best Supporting Actress award for her performance in this film.
Tish's mom, Sharon, is who Regina King played.
Correct. The film premiered at TIFF, or the Toronto International Film Festival, on September 9th, 2018, had a budget of $12 million and a global box office of $20.6 million, which I would argue is quite impressive, given that it is kind of an intimate drama. So almost nearly doubled its budget. It was nominated for Best Adapted Screenplay and Best Original Score, but ended up taking the award for Best Supporting Actress, as previously mentioned. Barry Jenkins, as a filmmaker, I was surprised to see that his filmography is relatively short for somebody who's had such an impact within like the filmmaking world over the last decade or so. He was born November 19th, 1979 in Miami, Florida. He had a short film called My Josephine that came out in 2001, but his feature film debut came out. It's called Medicine for Melancholy. It came out in 2008, and the film is essentially about a young couple's romance with the backdrop of San Francisco that is just like, you know, the poster for gentrification in the United States, right? And so we have these small intimate moments of tenderness between these two characters with the backdrop of a place that they've always known rapidly changing and becoming such a foreign place to them. You can see, given that that was his feature film debut, some similarities between Medicine for Melancholy and If Beale Street Could Talk. Definitely some, you know, thematic similarities as to why he would be drawn to that project. I don't know if this is true, Zach, but I saw somewhere that he was a writer on The Leftovers, which I know is a show that you adore, but I couldn't get that confirmed. But I really do hope that it is true because, well, that would bring me a small amount of joy.
Yeah, I would believe that. There's definitely elements of that show, specifically in the second season, that I could see Barry Jenkins's influence on. So that would not surprise me. I do very much think that is a very good show. Some people don't, but they're just wrong. They're wrong. It was critically acclaimed, and also I think it's good. So therefore,
The correct opinion on the matter.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah. I mean, yeah, that's what there is.
yeah. So anyway, in between Medicine for Melancholy, he had this 8-year hiatus, and then his next feature film was Moonlight, which could arguably be one of the finest films of the 21st century, which is rather astounding. If Beale Street Could Talk was made 2 years later, and then he has since worked on The Underground Railroad, which is a television series adapted from Colson Whitehead's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel. That is, I believe, on Amazon Prime streaming. I think it's either that or Hulu. But essentially, imagines sort of the Underground Railroad, right? This means by which enslaved folks were sort of ushered towards freedom during before the Civil War, but envisions that as like a literal railroad that sort of functions as a train, and uh, it is a piece of magical realism. A good novel. I would recommend it to folks if they're interested, but I haven't watched the show. And then the last thing that I could find for Barry Jenkins is that his next project coming out in 2024 supposedly is a Mufasa the Lion King, Mufasa the Lion King, which I have no idea if this is a Lion King prequel or a different interpretation of the Mufasa character, but I am interested. I hope it's good, and if I trust Jenkins to create a good piece of filmmaking, no matter what the source material. But it does raise like auteur is hired by Disney and given lots of money to make something that they're not totally invested in. But maybe that's not giving Jenkins enough credit. Maybe it'll be good. I hope so anyway.
So you're telling me that you're not totally invested and caught up in the greater Lion King extended cinematic universe?
I mean, I haven't seen the live action adaptation. I saw Lion King 2 and Lion King 1.5. And yeah, pretty good. Pretty good.
All right, well, I'll trust your opinion on it. I think I probably also saw those films as a child,
Yeah.
but we'll see what Barry Jenkins brings to the prestigious franchise.
Yeah, us and Lion King, we go way back. We were hanging out back in kindergarten, those were the days. Yeah,
Oh
anyway, so,
man.
so we'll see. With regards to If Beale Street Could Talk, the film adaptation, it's it's really a beautiful piece of filmmaking. I think that the colors are so vibrant, the intimacy that is captured within the characters themselves is just beautifully realized. You see this in Moonlight, and then it is replicated, I think, if Beale Street Could Talk. Right, there's the film Moonlight is essentially about an examination of blackness and queerness in the United States, which centers around an individual character as they grow up, and the challenges that they face being from those identity groups, right? So there's the intersectionality there of blackness and queerness, which is another tie-in to James Baldwin, right? A man himself who was queer and also black at a time when neither were very much accepted in the United States, right? And as we mentioned before, he felt the need to immigrate to France and then would write about his experiences from there and spend most of his time there. But anyway, that intimate portrait of black life that is so wonderfully captured in Moonlight is again captured in the film. A lot of close-ups on characters' faces, and the romance feels, I don't know. There's like a beauty to the the connection between Tish and Fonny. I know that it may sound like a cliche, but the chemistry between the two leads was palpable, right? It exists, and it was beautifully directed and acted. So I did feel that
Yeah.
the adaptation aesthetically was very, very, very good.
Yeah, all of the performances were great. You mentioned Regina King's Oscar win. You mentioned the pretty great ensemble cast. Diego Luna is a favorite of mine and just so delightful on the screen in pretty much every way. But also, you just talked about closeness, and we really get inserted into these scenes as if we are a member of the conversation, right? The rooms are small, the shots are close, they're from lower down. It is presented in a way that feels intimate and feels like you're there in the room with these characters in their small lives, right? It's the scope of this story is small, essentially. It's the story of these two people and their immediate families struggling in the world. And I don't know about you, but pretty much everyone I know has at least had one or two stories of being two people and struggling against the world. So that element is certainly not to dive into relatability as a test of media, but it is very human and very visceral,
Yeah,
even as they struggle against these larger, broader, systemic forces.
I mean, it reminds me of Timon and Pumbaa in A Lion King 1.5.
Oh my, that's if ever there was a story about two people struggling against the world. Oh, that's very, very funny.
But I mean, you're so right. I think that's we spend a lot of time with Tish and Fonny with like in the story, right? So we get an affinity through Baldwin's wonderful use of language for these two characters. And what filmmaking allows is sort of a visualization of that. And in the hands of someone like Jenkins, I mean, even little choices, like I think at the first time we see these characters, Tish is wearing a predominantly blue outfit with sort of a yellow accent, and Fonny is wearing a predominantly yellow outfit with like a blue accent, and you just see that these two characters complement each other so well. Like that is a deliberate like wardrobe choice at the introduction of our two protagonists of the story, right? Other things that are at least sort of these visual choices that allow for difference is at the beginning of the novel. There, it goes to great lengths to introduce Mrs. Hunt, right, and her performative behavior in church. That is totally excised from the movie. It just doesn't exist, right? It's just the first time we meet her is as she walks into the Rivers' home, which is Tish's last name.
Mhm.
The performance of Who plays Mrs. Hunt? Do you know, Zach?
No, I had it up, but
Okay.
I just moved on to a different note. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
While you look that up, I will talk about her because it really does, like, this is a great example of a few frames of film subitizing a lot of text in a novel, right? We immediately look at this character and understand who she is. It is very clear without the somewhat lengthy scene in the novel of them going to church. I talked about it earlier, and it was a good scene in the novel, and it really set up a lot of that dynamic. But it became just sort of not necessary in the film, which to me is good adaptation work to recognize. Okay, this is extraneous in this medium, and we can cut it and it will be better for it. We won't miss it. We can provide that information to the reader, to the audience in a different way.
Ingenue Ellis plays Mrs. Hunt and does so rather well. As we've said, the acting in this film was was excellent. But yeah, no, I mean, besides that, the other, I guess, plot differences between the story is at the end. I think is the main one. Was there anything else that should be mentioned regarding plot wise, Zach? Besides,
No, I mean, I talked about like the little extra details we get about Officer Bell and his interaction. There are slight differences with the way they find a place. We spend much less time with Daniel in the film, which I think is actually to our detriment.
I
I know we
agree.
talked about this uh, in the alternate universe edition of this episode, but I would like to dive into it again because the way that Tish and Fonny interact with Daniel is such an example of kindness and chosen family and community, maybe in the purest form we get in the novel, because there is no blood family between them, but Daniel shows up and Fonny immediately welcomes him, invites him home. Tish, who was not expecting company, immediately welcomes him and goes to the store, prepares dinner. And in the film, it's sort of that one interaction, right, where they talk about how Daniel just got out of jail and how it has essentially broken him, the way he was treated. But in the novel, he comes back many times and he becomes a regular fixture at their household. And they talk about how they're always welcoming and glad to be able to share that hospitality. And Tish, who is the narrator of the novel, talks about how sometimes Fonny holds him and sometimes she holds him and sometimes they both hold him as he works through the trauma that he's endured. And that is devastatingly sad, but also heart-rendingly beautiful in its own way. So that's one thing that I missed from the film that I really enjoyed from the novel.
Totally. And it just plays into that idea between like hope and despair, right? That we have sort of outlined from at the beginning. I agree, and I think that it should be mentioned that Brian Tyree Henry's performance was a highlight. I think in a room of actors and performances, I do think that his still stood out in the film. I definitely, but maybe that is because we had such an affinity for Daniel. At least I did because I had read the book beforehand, and I was looking forward to being introduced to this character's on-screen performance.
That's interesting
Yeah, I don't know.
because I didn't have that, but the performance also stood out to me. It was very very good performance.
Yeah. One of the things that I definitely wanted to just touch on is so we mentioned that Victoria Rogers slash Victoria Sanchez has been the victim of rape, and in the film it's far more distressing. I think we can both agree there that sort of the emotion that is conveyed on screen through the performance of the actress becomes difficult to watch, and understandably so, right? This is an incredibly traumatic thing that this woman has been subject to. In the book, I think that we're rooting so hard for Fonny and Tish that when Sharon goes to Puerto Rico to beg Victoria to change the accusation that she's levied against Fonny and it is unsuccessful, we come away from that thinking, oh man, like this is Victoria's fault. Like how dare how could she not understand that, she's essentially ruining this young man's life, right? And I definitely fell into that trap, and this is I'm certainly willing to accept this as a failing of my reading and my initial reading, but like then seeing the adaptation and sort of the visualization of the how Victoria sort of breaks down, it becomes that much more apparent that this is not Victoria's fault. She is a victim. She was still subjected to a horrific example of abuse. The failing is with the justice system, right? The failing is with these larger societal establishments, and it's not this individual's fault. And so I wonder, had I not watched the film, if I would have come away with that. I imagine through our conversation that that point would hopefully have been brought up, and I would have been able to kind of piece it together again, or maybe if I reread the story. I certainly know that those larger societal failings were definitely pointed out by Baldwin, but it was, I felt it, I felt that the film's adaptation of the story, at least for me, enhanced that criticism that it levied originally by Baldwin. And I'm curious to hear, because you had watched the film first. I'm curious if that had a similar, if or not similar impact. How you sort of viewed that scene within the context of each medium.
Yeah, I mean, in that film, it is a heartbreaking scene. It's very impactful. I mentioned earlier that it feels sort of like the emotional climax of the film, and it really does. And as to your point and your interpretation and how that changed, it's easy to forget that Victoria Sanchez is also being failed by the same system that is failing Fonny, by putting him up as sort of this like scapegoat type thing because of one officer's personal grudge. It also ensures that Victoria is not receiving any kind of actual justice. And would she, had they not tried to pin this on Fonny? Probably not, quite frankly. As a poor Puerto Rican who felt like her only recourse was to go back home into what is described in the novel as the slummest of slums, essentially. And that doesn't get brought into the film at all, actually. But she's, as you said, a victim not only of a heinous crime, but also of these same systemic issues. And that's something that isn't necessarily said explicitly in the text, but is very much there.
Absolutely. On that point about the experience and like the physical setting that is described in the novel's rendering of Puerto Rico, there is a moment where Sharon says, I had never seen it like that before. Never. I don't speak no Spanish and they don't speak no English, but we on the same garbage dump for the same reason. So there's that moment of sort of unity between, Latinx and the Black community, and this realization further on that says, whoever discovered America deserved to be dragged home in chains to die. And something that was in my edition of the story is that the last line is, so maybe a publication date from Baldwin, and it's October 12th, 1973. And then it says just prior to that, Columbus Day, right? So I would think that that has to be intentional. This idea that like, hey, this myth of the United States being discovered and this it being this sort of like land of opportunity and freedom, and it's great, right? Is a fallacy, right? For so many people who are not white, for lack of a better phrase.
Yeah. Yeah, and maybe this is a good time to acknowledge that we are two white guys talking about a story that is very much about blackness and marginalizedness in America, and that is not our experience in the world. And that's not to say that our lives are perfect or untarnished by systemic failings in any regard, but these are specific issues that do not apply to us. And it's probably just worth mentioning that not to speak for you, Russell, but I know that you also are aware of these things as we have this discussion and talk about stories about and lives of characters who are not us and not like us in all ways, but maybe through not just the magic of storytelling, but the human experience, also very like us in other ways.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that we are going to make a deliberate attempt to, you know, try to do justice to these works and their adaptations, and try to include stories from various perspectives. I think that given that our first episode was about sort of like Roald Dahl, right, and adapted by Wes Anderson, I do think that it is very likely that some of the stories that we are drawn to and the adaptations that we are drawn to are going to be by white dudes, and that I think in itself is a failing of sort of like the system, right? Like most of these stories that are then adapted are by like white dudes. So we are going to try our best to diversify the selection of stories and adaptations, and we think that I know that, and I will speak for you here, Zach, that uh, not doing so would be a significant flaw on our part if we just stuck to white dudes. So yeah, again, we're gonna try our best, and if we can improve in any way, just let us know.
And that's an important point you mentioned too, that like not only necessarily are we potentially drawn to stories from white dudes, but that is what gets made
Yeah.
hugely predominantly in the system. I was having a discussion with Ty, our dear friend Ty, the other week, probably weeks ago at this point, about Elvis and how it's not Elvis's fault that he became famous for maybe whiteifying or gentrifying a type of music that was maybe predominantly black at the expense of black artists. Elvis didn't choose that. It is a systemic failing that it was, oh, the white guy doing this kind of music that was then given the record deal and promoted. And we see that in every form of media, that the majority voice gets amplified far more than is actually representative.
Yeah, totally. Should we talk about the end, the different endings?
Let's talk about the end. Let's talk about the different endings. Yeah, I hinted at this, or I didn't hint at this. I said what they are earlier. I kind of gave my take. What was your take on the different ending, Russell? What worked for you? What didn't work for you?
So as you mentioned, the book sort of ends rather abruptly. We get this brief mention of Frank's tragic death by suicide, and it is unclear whether Fonny will get out. And we've
Ever.
talked about the peaks and valleys. Yeah, ever the peaks and valleys, the hope and despair that the novel sort of waffles between, and sort of as the story progresses, we see those realized in different ways. I viewed the novel's ending as hopeful. Right, we get this absolute tragedy that occurs with Frank's passing, and Sharon unable to get Victoria to change her mind, and I can only think that given the rhythms of the story up until that point, that there is a hopeful ending that is not explicitly stated, but will come to fruition outside of the context outside of the confines of the written word. So
The the baby gets born at the end of the novel, right? Like there is sort of a birthing scene, like just before the
I don't
end.
think so.
Am I totally misremembering that? Because, and I'm not like a huge, oh, X symbolizes Y in fiction, but the baby is kind of like the hope of the future, right? That is sort of what's going on there, and I really don't like interfacing with media this way, so maybe I'm going to cut myself short.
You're right. The last couple of lines from the story, Fani is working on the wood on the stone, whistling, smiling, and from far away, but coming nearer, the baby cries and 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 cries like it means to wake the dead. So the baby, I don't know if that is just a vision. Maybe I think that I interpreted this as just a vision, not something that was real. But
Sure.
yeah, I mean, you're right. The baby itself is sort of a symbol of like of hope, right, and of a new beginning and of innocence and all these various positive things that we attach to new life. I know that, and to contrast that interpretation of the book, the film ends on that additional scene, that epilogue that you mentioned earlier, where Fonny takes the plea deal, very much like Daniel was forced to, and is serving some time in prison, and the only time he gets to see his child is during these visits, and the injustice and the the sadness that is on the characters' faces, or the actors' faces, excuse me, just left me feeling just kind of bummed out, which was the opposite reaction I had to reading the story. And I know that interestingly enough, you had the inverse. Am I correct here?
Yeah, I don't know if I would say specifically inverse, but I wouldn't say that I found the end of the novel hopeful. I found it to be unresolved in the way that only a story can leave you feeling when it doesn't, it doesn't deliver a happy ending. It doesn't deliver really any kind of conclusion for any of these characters. And we are so used to narrative that does have at least an ending, and it doesn't have to be a happy ending. For example, and I'm so sorry, at the end of Rogue One, all the main characters die, and that's not a happy ending, but it is an ending, and it feels fulfilling narratively that we have seen this story and we know what happens and we know, like, that's the end of it. Whereas in this novel, like, we're essentially back where we started, right? No progress has been made over the course of this story. We've gotten this glimpse into Tish and Fani's life and their past, and we, the audience, the reader, are better for it. But our characters are in essentially exactly the same spot with one or two less options. Frank is dead. Finding Victoria is not an escape route anymore. So, if anything, maybe they're worse off than they were.
It could be. Again, in an interview with The Guardian, he does say, he being James Baldwin, does say that he is an optimist. But I can only imagine, right, that as you say, like no progress has been made. I think we're left to question, like, well, has progress been made in our world, right, with regards to these issues that have been brought forth by James Baldwin, and that have created significant challenges for a wide cast of characters within the story, not just our protagonists, but everybody else. And it's hard to say that over the span of the last 50 years now that much progress has been made. And so maybe there is a very much a dour feeling there. What do you think of that?
Do you think, I'm going to ask that or answer that question with one of my own? Do you think that's sort of what Barry Jenkins was trying to say by adding on that epilogue? That well, the novel was written in the 70s and the film was made in the 2010s. Like, yeah, okay, we're still here and that child is growing up, but Fonny is seeing it from jail in Visitation. Is that like a timeline commentary from the filmmaker?
I would think so. I mean, I think that, in addition to the things that we've already mentioned and what Barry Jenkins seems to be interested in is in the stories that he wants to tell, like, there's a reason that he chose to make this movie in 2018, right? I do think that when Joyce Carol Oates, to return to something that we talked about, says that this book is timeless, the timelessness of the story, the narrative, the written word, it doesn't feel out of place to have that, as a film in what is the last 5 years, right? I mean, and when we had watched it in 2023, and it still feels relevant, right? And so,
Yeah, and that timelessness itself is simultaneously tragic because of the sad parts of the story and delightful because of the good parts of the story. And that's baby's first media literacy course right there. The good parts are good and the sad parts are bad. But what I'm saying is that, like, yes, there are elements of this story that we want to be timeless, right? We want to see the love of a young couple be timeless. We want to see familial support and community support. We didn't talk about it today, but the support that Pedrocito and that Spanish restaurant extends to Tish while Fonny is in jail is a factor in the novel that doesn't get brought up in the film, and I get why it's a little extraneous. But they really take care of her. They feed her. They drive her to and from Visitation. And all because, like, they were kind of close with Fonny and they recognize an injustice, right? They don't have any other connection. And those elements are things we want to be timeless and we want to find in our everyday life, and that is beautiful in its own way. So, pros and cons, I guess.
yeah, with that, I'm going to make you choose here: the film or the book, Zach.
This is a close one. They've all been close so far. This is episode 3 of this podcast. We had really 3 very faithful adaptations so far, and spoiler alert, that's going to change next week. But 3 very faithful adaptations. They've all been close decisions. We didn't actually discuss this pivotal question for Henry Sugar, but I think it probably would have been close. Maybe the book would have edged it for me, or the short story. Last time for Arrival, Story of Your Life, we both sided narrowly with the novella. Although maybe in retrospect, that is becoming less of a narrow decision for me. That story is just so good. It's so good. But for today, for If Beale Street Could Talk, I am going to pick the novel also, but by a thin margin. And the reason why is because it's not a good phrase. The extra details that we got in the novel. I talked about the extra amount of Daniel and Fonny and Tish's relationship, the extra little bits of Pedrocito and the Spanish restaurant, and those things really fleshed out the world for me in a way that was impactful. But I acknowledge that maybe I only feel that way because I read it after seeing the movie, and the movie does such a good job, as you've talked about, of giving us a glimpse into these characters' lives, and the performances are so good, and the cinematography and the costuming are so good that it was a great first entry for me into this world of this story. And then the novel felt like, here's more information, and it didn't feel like there was a clash because they are really telling the same story. It is a very faithful adaptation. So that is, from my perspective, my pick. Russell, it is now your turn to answer this question.
I'm also going to choose the novel. I think that while everything that you said was true, Barry Jenkins is a phenomenal filmmaker, and I really enjoyed the film adaptation, and I encourage everybody to check it out. I would highly encourage folks, if they haven't read anything by James Baldwin, to check out his novelization of the story. If Beale Street Could Talk felt like a wonderful entry into his body of work, and I was absolutely riveted the entire time that I was reading this story. And I, it just seems like a very important story to experience at some point in one's life. And yeah, I'm also going to pick the book for those reasons. I think that James Baldwin was a brilliant writer, and it has inspired me to check out more of his stuff too. So I'm also going to select the book.
Great. Yeah, great novel. I read it in one day. It really was riveting, page turner, and it wasn't one sitting, but it was, it was one calendar day that I went through this book, and it didn't feel like I was rushing through it. It was gripping in the language and the description of things. Yeah, so there you have it.
There you go. If Beale Street Could Talk, check out both. Please join us next episode when we talk about The Curious Case of Benjamin Button by F. Scott Fitzgerald and adapted by David Fincher. Looking forward to talking about that. I have seen the film. In fact, I own the film, but haven't yet read the short story. Zach, you have neither read nor viewed the film, which is surprising given that Fincher is your guy. He's maybe
Yeah,
your
Fincher was my first favorite director. I will say that now, at time of this recording, I have both watched the film and read the story
okay. Well,
because
me too. Yes, now. Okay.
but when we first planned to cover this story, it's true. I had never seen the movie. I never read the story. I didn't even know it was a short story by F. Scott Fitzgerald. But over the last week, I have read and watched it, and I actually have a lot of opinions. So I'm looking forward to discussing this. I'll note that we did this the opposite order now because you had seen the film, so you watched it and then read it, and I did the opposite. I read it and then watched it. Yeah, a lot of thoughts about this one. Russell, do you have a lot of thoughts about this one?
So many thoughts. So many
Good.
thoughts. I really looking forward to it, and I hope that you'll all join us. Thank you for listening, everybody. We'll see you next time.